I can't imagine anything that they've done wrong, certainly not in proportion to what it is that they're experiencing. And most often, I always find if an atheist wants to argue against the Christian faith, this to me is kind of the best weapon they've got, right? I mean, this question of innocent suffering, when things seem wrong in the world, if we're going to believe that God is all-powerful and can do anything, and we're also going to believe that God is all good, wanting what's in our best interests, it's really difficult to look at pictures like that one and make sense of those ideas in light of the reality of suffering and difficulty and loss that we experience sometimes in the world. And truthfully, I think part of what makes it hard for us is that all of our responses as Christians to the problem of innocent suffering, somehow they have to hinge around the idea of waiting for God and trusting in God. That God is not going to constantly intervene in the world. He's not going to constantly jump down and disrupt our experiences. He's not going to stop us from doing the things that we intend to do or anything like that. Since God is not going to constantly be stepping in and interrupting the world, the way that the world works is there are going to be people who suffer greatly. And the question that we're asking when this is going on is, God, where are you? I'm trying to trust that you're good. I'm trying to trust that one day you are going to make everything right. But it's really difficult in the short term, especially in the midst of our suffering and difficulties, to wait for the Lord, waiting for the Lord. There's a lot of people in Scripture I think about and imagine how difficult it must have been for them to keep waiting. I think, for example, of Queen Esther, the Queen of Persia. You may remember she was a young Jewish girl who won a beauty pageant to replace the prior queen, and the circumstances that brought her to queenship were pretty negative. The king's wife, he had asked her to come out and perform for his buddies. We don't know exactly what that meant, but we assume basically they're just wanting to kind of gawk at her because she was beautiful, and she didn't want to be demeaned in that way. And so he removes her from being queen, and it's, in fact, all the guys in power get together and say, we've got to set a precedent in the land because we got to make sure these Persian women know their place, so to speak, right? We can't have them telling us that they don't want to do everything we say they have to do. And so there's a very negative precedent for what it means to be queen, and certainly what it would mean to be queen and to defy the king or to do something not in accordance with what it was he was asking for. So when that powerful, wicked person named Haman, who is very high up in the kingdom, sets his targets on the Jewish people, Esther, who is a Jew, but quietly and secretly recognizes that because of where she is, it's like she has to do something. I mean, she can't do nothing, as her uncle tells her. Maybe you're in the position you're in specifically for such a time as this. And I trust, and he's a good example of that trust in times of difficulty. I trust that our deliverance will come from somewhere, and if it's not from you, it'll be from somebody, but maybe this is why you are in the position that you're in. But it says that she took a period of several days to pray and to ask her people to be praying as she prepared to approach the king to beg him to spare the lives of her people, or at least enable them to do something so that they could defend themselves. But you must imagine what it would have been like to have been her during those days of praying. I mean, we know that the story has the happy ending and that God, does provide a good resolution to the story. But if you let yourself live for a moment in those days of prayer leading up to her very uncomfortable approaching of the king with her request, she must have been praying intensely. God, where are you? My people are going to get slaughtered. I mean, the one precedent I know for me as a queen is you don't just walk into the king's throne room and ask him for things. I have to be summoned. I could lose my life. Everything about that circumstance was so difficult. Everything seemed like it could lead to a death sentence. So, of course, she must have prayed, God, where are you right now? Even Jesus, as he hung from the cross, he's surrounded by people who were there to shame him. I mean, the worst part of the cross, I mean, we tend to focus on, in our Western mindset, we focus on like the physical aspects of suffering and pain inflicted by crucifixion. But if you read the way that the gospel writers tell the story, they saw the worst part of the cross being the shame of the cross, being regarded as a criminal, being regarded as a lowlife, having the public pronounce you as guilty and worthless and not deserving to live, and having to die as your enemies looked at you hanging there naked and embarrassed. Jesus himself, there abandoned by his friends, prays from Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me?" It's that same question. God, where are you? And even surely Jesus must have known the answer to that question, but all the same, because of where he was, he was asking that question. God, where are you right now? What are you doing? So last week, we talked about God's grand movements in history. We were talking about God with us, how if you look at everything from the garden, all the steps that God took with the children of Israel, all that God did through the incarnation of Jesus, the Word becoming flesh, what he did through the sending of the Spirit, what he's going to do as he ushers in the new heavens and the new earth, all the things that God has done in history, we know he's been working things together for our good. We believe that and we trust that. So there are those moments in history that are conspicuous, and we can say, here's a place where God acted. Here's a place where God intervened. Here are some things that God did for our betterment. I thought it would be worthwhile today to reflect on kind of the flip side of that coin. What about all the times when it's just not clear to us what God is up to? Sometimes he acts boldly, but then a lot of the times, from our angle, it sure feels like perhaps he's being silent. So the scripture for today from Psalm 113, How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and day after day have sorrow in my head? How long will my enemy triumph over me? Look on me and answer, Lord my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep in death, and my enemy will say, I have overcome him, and my foes will rejoice when I fall. But I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. I will sing the Lord's praise, for he has been good to me. I love the way that psalm encapsulates all those thoughts we've been talking about. I mean, the reality of suffering, the reality of feeling in danger and not understanding why things are happening in our lives the way that they are. But just the same, he says, yes, but I am going to trust in God's unfailing love. And even though if I can't see exactly what he's doing right now, I trust that his love is unfailing and he's not going to do nothing. Maybe you saw the movie Castaway. It came out in the year 2000, starring Tom Hanks. And I don't like people who give spoilers to movies, but you've had 18 years to watch this one, so I'm just going to talk about it anyways, okay? So it's a story about a FedEx executive who is a workaholic. He's got a longtime girlfriend who he's just proposed to. I believe her name is Kelly. He's proposed to Kelly, and he says, I'm sorry, I've got this big deal cooking. And so he has to fly out on Christmas Day. And as he's flying out, of course, his plane crashes. There are no survivors but him. And he finds himself on this deserted, tiny island all by himself. And most of the movie is about his experiences there, where he, for 4 years, has no other human contact. It's merely just himself alone on that island, having to learn how to do everything on his own. How is it that you're going to start a fire? How is it that you're going to build shelter for yourself? And he has to work through all these things. There are the physical difficulties of him being there, but then there's also the emotional impact of really being isolated away from all the people that you're thinking about. In fact, he finally gives in. He has a few FedEx packages, and he finally gives in and opens several of them just because he's bored. And of course, he ends up taking that volleyball. Do y'all remember what the volleyball's name is? Wilson. Everybody knows Wilson, right? Yeah, he names it Wilson. And he has a lot of robust conversations with Wilson just because it's so hard to be alone. But the thing that kind of keeps him going over those 4 years is that he's got this pocket watch from his fiancée, Kelly. And he keeps telling himself, one day I'm going to get back with her, I'm going to get reunited with her, and he's just trusting she's going to be there. And so finally, after 4 years, he's rescued, and then there's the awkward encounter of him finally going back, kind of trying to find the old parts of his life, which a lot has changed in 4 years. But then he finds Kelly and discovers that she has moved on. Of course, she had presumed that he was dead, just like all the other passengers. And so at this point, she's married, she has children, she has moved on. And she even says to him, this to me was particularly stinging, she says, "I wanted to wait for you, but everyone else told me I should move on, so I did. I felt like I should keep waiting, but everyone around me, I trusted them, I took their advice. I'm so sorry, I always thought you were the love of my life, but at this point, things have changed and I've just moved on." I think for us, when we go through these times where we feel like we're experiencing what we would call the absence of God, not that he's really absent, but it feels like he may be absent, what we're tempted to do is simply to move on in one way or another. I think this may be part of what was happening in the life of Judas Iscariot. There's a situation in Matthew chapter 26. They're in a little town called Bethany, and this woman has this expensive little jar, an alabaster jar of perfume. It cost a fortune, just an enormous amount of money. It was about the price of like a mid-size SUV for this one bottle of perfume. Extremely expensive. But she goes to Jesus in that town, and she breaks it open, and she anoints it with it, and the aroma fills the whole place where everyone can smell it, and it's considered this beautiful gesture. And you may remember some of the apostles, Judas in particular, pipes up and says, "You know, we could have taken that and sold that and had money for the poor. There's a lot of better decisions we could have made with how to use that expensive perfume." And of course, Jesus does not give him the answer that he wanted, which seems to be an ongoing theme in Jesus' encounters with his apostles. They wanted him to be one kind of Messiah, but he's not the Messiah we want. He's the Messiah that we actually need. And so he says, "No, what she's done is beautiful. She's preparing me for my burial. What she's done is going to be told in her memory." And here I am, thousands of years later, still telling this story in her memory. So he was right. But we tell this as a beautiful story of her love, an expression of love for Christ. But Judas, it seems, was very angry about this. I find it interesting that the very next passage there in Matthew 26, immediately after Jesus kind of rebukes him for doing that or saying that, Jesus goes to some of the Jewish leaders and starts asking about, what is it that you would give me if I would turn him over to you? Judas probably had expectations for Jesus of being some kind of great military leader. You know, I thought we were supposed to kick these Romans out of Jerusalem. I thought we were supposed to reestablish the kingdom and the throne of David, and we were going to start being God's real chosen people again and ruling the world. And they're thinking in all these earthly terms, which is, Jesus is thinking about something so much bigger than that. But surely it must have been frustrating to say, well, if you're supposed to be God, why aren't you doing the things that I thought the Messiah was supposed to be doing? If you're really God's person, why aren't you doing those things? And I've wondered if perhaps what he was doing was trying to force Jesus' hand just a bit. If I force the confrontation, if I force things to move forward, maybe finally he'll get around to being the Messiah that I wanted him to be. So when God didn't do what Judas wanted him to do, Judas's response was to move on and find a new master. And like so many people in the world, that new master he chased after, at least for that time, was money, wasn't it? What will you give me? I might as well make a little bit of cash off this if I'm going to have to keep waiting. And just like we experience when we put our hope in our possessions and material things, we end up feeling disappointed. So for us, obedience becomes such an important principle for the way that we live. Continuing to do the right thing, certainly when it feels like God is with us and it feels like God is near, but also when it feels like we've been defeated and we wonder whether God might even be there at all. We have to strive to continue honoring our part of the deal, trusting that God is going to show up again and that his love is unfailing and that he is working all things together for good, at least eventually. So I want to invite you to think about this from a different angle. Because most often when we come to this problem of God not doing everything that I want him to do on the schedule that I want him to do it, we tend to think about this scenario from our own angle. You know, why is God not doing the things I thought God is supposed to do for me? But have you ever considered kind of the inverted version on the other side of the mirror, What if God were to start asking those same questions about us? I mean, we all talk about, how do I feel when God gives me reason to doubt him? But how does God feel when we give him reasons to doubt us? What is God's response to us when we're the ones who don't do the things he had thought we were supposed to do, the things that we had committed ourselves to doing? I've wondered if God were to speak aloud to us in those times where we're asking, God, where are you? I wonder if he might respond back and say, well, where exactly have you been? What about when you became a Christian and you committed to me that we were going to make regular time together? You were going to meet me every morning in prayer. Every morning I show up, but where are you? I wanted to be the first one that you talk to about anything in your life that you're struggling with, anything that's difficult. I wanted you to pound on my chest and whisper in my ear and share those things with me. But instead of treating me like a trusted advisor and a closest friend, you're just treating me like I'm your last resort. You talk to me when no other options work. Once you realize you can't possibly solve it on your own, then grudgingly you talk to me. I thought I was supposed to be your best friend. Where have you been? Where are you? Maybe he might say, I watch you as you take these thousands and thousands of selfies and all the stuff you post on social media where you're trying to craft this perfect image of what you want people to see and think about you. But I've always just loved you for the way that I made you. You are precious to me whether you do anything or not, whether you look impressive or not, whether you accomplish anything or not. But you're so worried about what everyone else thinks about you. Why can't you find some contentment in knowing what I think about you? That to me, you're precious. To me, you're my child. To me, that I'm just so happy that you're mine, but you're not worried about what I think. Where have you been? Where are you? Perhaps he might bring up the fact that the last time you and I had a good conversation was when you kept asking me to get you that promotion, that new opportunity you wanted, and you were telling me all the good things you hoped to do. Once that new job, that new position finally came through and you were able to do more, all the stuff you really said you wanted to do for the kingdom, and instead, the only thing you've done with your increased blessings is just to squander it on yourself. So you want to have conversations about starving children in other parts of the world and ask what I haven't been doing. Well, what about when I gave you the resources to do something about it, and instead you bought a new car? I think God could ask us some very hard questions along that same line. We ask God, where are you? But God, I think, has every right to also be asking us, where have you been? What have you been doing? What about this promise that we made to each other? It's not just a one-sided promise, it's a covenant. I'll be accountable to you, but you said you're also going to be accountable to me. So a key difference between us and God is that when we don't know what God is up to, it's an easy temptation for us to just let ourselves off the hook in terms of covenant faithfulness. I really wanted this and God didn't do it for me, and I'm not sure what he's up to, so I think I'm just going to move on and do something else, and God goes way down on the priority list. But see, God is so different than that. Because even in times when we've been separate from God or we've turned our back on God, God has not turned his back on us. God has remained faithful to us even when we've been faithless to him. He's continued to love us first and foremost, even when we haven't even had him on our list of priorities. God is and has always been faithful. And when we look to restore that relationship and return to him, he's not anxious to scold us. He's like the father of the prodigal son who's going to run out to meet us, who's just been waiting for us to come home. He's not interested in trying to prove to you that he's right. He just wants you to have a relationship with him, to have a good and meaningful life that you find by walking with him. I wanted to share a couple of passages with you that I think are helpful. 2 Timothy chapter 2, here's a little poem. Paul says this is a trustworthy saying. Here's something you should pay attention to. He says it's trustworthy. If we died with him, we will also live with him. If we endure, we will also reign with him. If we disown him, he will also disown us. If we are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot disown himself. Even if God had every reason to walk away from you, it is not in His character to do that. It is in His character to be faithful, to continue loving, to continue inviting and welcoming, because that's just who He is. He doesn't respond to us according to what we deserve, but according to His love, His unfailing love, and His mercy. Even when we're faithless, God is faithful because He cannot disown who He is or His personality. We want to strive to be people who mirror that on our side, where we know that God is faithful even when He can't see perhaps like what it is that we're trying to do from our angle, even when we can't see what God is up to and we're not sure what He's thinking or when He's coming around. We have to be faithful the way that God is faithful, even when we're not sure and we ask the hard questions, that we don't give up. A second passage is in Philippians chapter 2, verses 12 and 13. Where Paul says, and of course here he's speaking of his own absence, he says, "Therefore, my dear friends, as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you to will and to act in order to fulfill His good purpose." So I would not even begin to try and minimize the experience of suffering in the world. When you've been treated unjustly, when you've been dealt an unfair hand, I mean, the pain from that is real. The struggles are very real. So I don't in any way want to minimize those things. But I do want to remind us that if we stay faithful and we stay strong and we choose not to give up, even when it feels easier to give up, that in the end, God promises us, Paul gives us that trustworthy word, in the end, things are worthwhile. Whatever it is we think we've given up for God, as we talked about last week, God has just been storing up, waiting for us, that He is going to treat us according to His goodness and according to His mercy, not just according to what we deserve. Commitments are things that stand regardless of whether anyone is watching us or not. And my challenge for each of us this morning is in your life, even when things are difficult, but certainly also when things are going well, to be a person who is faithful to what promises you have made to God in your life. Because we know that even when we can't see what He's up to, God is still working things together for our good. And He's not going to leave us as orphans. He's going to come back. He's going to help us. He's going to get us through the things that we're experiencing. So we need to mirror that faithfulness and continue to trust in Him. This morning, if you need somehow to respond to this message, if we could say a prayer for you for your strength and encouragement, if there's some special need that you have, if this morning you do want to make that commitment to Christ, that you are going to put Him on in baptism, you are going to commit your life to Him and walking with Him. Whatever your needs are this morning, this is the time you can respond if you'd like by coming forward as together we stand and sing.